You find yourself standing in the shadows of a decaying villa outside Rome as the dawn light barely breaks through the morning mist of June 9th, 68 AD. The air is thick with fear and desperation. Through the half-rotted wooden door, you hear the most powerful man in the known world, a man who once led legions, burned cities for amusement, and murdered his own mother sobbing like a frightened child. His voice, once trained to fill amphitheaters with melodic performances, now cracks and trembles as he repeatedly mutters, "Qualis artifex pereo," meaning, "What an artist dies in me." This is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the 5th emperor of Rome, in his final pathetic hours. The man who kicked his pregnant wife to death, who castrated a boy to replace her, and who watched Rome burn while writing poetry about Troy, is about to die not in glorious battle, nor surrounded by loyal guards, but hiding in a freedman's hovel, too cowardly to even drive the blade into his own throat. To understand how the most powerful man on earth ended up in this miserable state, we must go back to where it all began, in the treacherous halls of imperial power, where a teenage sociopath first tasted blood. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider liking this video and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. It's incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected by our shared curiosity about the past. December 15th, 37th, a child is born in the seaside town of Antium as the first rays of dawn touch his skin, an omen that ancient Romans would claim foretold his fiery nature. Lucius Domitius Enobarbus, as he was first named, was born into a lineage already stained with the blood of generations. His family history reads like a catalogue of violence and cruelty stretching back centuries. His great-great-grandfather had ridden through Gaul on an elephant, displaying the severed heads of enemies like trophies. His grandfather gouged out a Roman knight's eye in the forum for speaking against him. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was so vicious that when friends congratulated him on his son's birth, he replied honestly that nothing but the abominable and a public bane could be born of Agrippina and himself. How prophetic those words would prove to be. The boy's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was perhaps the most dangerous woman in Rome, sister to Emperor Caligula and great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. She possessed a lethal combination of imperial blood and ruthless ambition. She had already been exiled once for plotting against her brother, buried one husband under suspicious circumstances, and was scheming to place her son on the throne. When young Lucius was just 3, his father passed away. Rumors of poison circulated, though some claimed it was dropsy that finally took him. The boy inherited 1/3 of his father's estate, but even this was taken when Emperor Caligula seized the family's wealth. Agrippina was banished to a barren island, leaving the child with his aunt Lipitor and only 2 servants, a dancer and a barber, not quite tutors for a future emperor. Yet Agrippina refused to accept defeat. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD and her uncle Claudius became emperor, she seduced her way back to power. She married Gaius Sallustius Passianus Crispus, one of Rome's richest men, who conveniently died shortly after, leaving her his fortune. Then she set her sights on the ultimate prize, the emperor himself. Claudius already had a wife, Messalina, known for her legendary sexual appetites, even by Roman standards. But Messalina's mistake of marrying her lover, Gaius Silius, while still wed to the emperor, gave Agrippina her opportunity. Messalina was executed, and Agrippina moved in for the kill. Picture this: Emperor Claudius, a stammering, drooling man in his 60s, utterly captivated by his beautiful niece. Roman law forbade marriage between uncle and niece, but as emperor, laws were mere suggestions. In 49 AD, 12-year-old Lucius watched as his mother became Empress of Rome, paving his path to power. Agrippina acted swiftly, convincing Claudius to adopt her son, who was renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. At 13, he donned the toga of manhood. At 14, he was declared heir to the throne, surpassing Claudius's own son Britannicus. And at 15, he married Claudius's daughter Octavia, becoming both heir and son-in-law. But Agrippina was impatient. In October 54 AD, Emperor Claudius had dinner and never rose again. Officially, it was a stomach ailment from mushrooms, but everyone knew the truth. Agrippina had grown tired of waiting and served her husband poisoned mushrooms. His favorite dish became his last meal. Some sources suggest when the first dose failed, she enlisted Locusta, a professional poisoner, who finished the job by thrusting a feather dipped in poison down the emperor's throat under the guise of helping him vomit. Claudius died in agony, his body convulsing as the poison ravaged his insides. At 17, Nero ascended to become the ruler of the known world. Initially, the signs were promising. The young emperor's first actions seemed to demonstrate mercy and wisdom. When asked to sign a death warrant, a routine task for Roman emperors, he famously wished he had never learned to write. He lowered taxes, generously gifted the people, and vowed to govern like Augustus. However, those closest to him noticed flaws in the facade. His tutor Seneca would later say he felt like he was teaching Caligula again, a nightmare that became prophetic. While Nero spoke of mercy publicly, he was secretly planning his first murder, his stepbrother, Britannicus. Claudius's biological son, Britannicus, was a potential rival to the throne. At 14, Britannicus was a quiet boy with no ambition for power, but to Nero, his existence was a threat. The murder was meticulously planned. It occurred during a dinner party in the palace, surrounded by Roman elite. Britannicus requested his wine be cooled with water, a common practice. However, Locusta, who had helped kill Claudius, poisoned the water. As guests watched in horror, the boy sipped and immediately convulsed. His face turned blue, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. His body was racked with spasms as the poison coursed through him. Nero ate calmly, telling shocked guests it was merely an epileptic fit, as Britannicus was known to have them. The boy died within minutes, foam at his mouth, limbs twisted in agony. Nero ordered the body removed and the dinner to continue. When someone suggested calling a doctor, the emperor responded indifferently, saying there was no need. This was just the beginning. The monster was just starting to taste blood. For the first years of his reign, Nero was restrained by three powerful advisors: his mother Agrippina, his tutor Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. This group, later called the Good Influences, kept his worst impulses in check. Under their guidance, the empire enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero. But Agrippina had not orchestrated her son's rise to power just to watch him be controlled by others. Having experienced ultimate power as the emperor's mother, she was unwilling to let it go. She made demands, insisted on being consulted about state affairs, demanded to sit beside Nero at official ceremonies, and even suggested her image appear on Roman coins alongside his. Nero chafed under his mother's control. The young emperor wanted to experience the pleasures of power without the responsibilities. He wished to race chariots, perform on stage, and sleep with whomever he desired, activities his mother deemed unworthy of an emperor. The breaking point came when Nero fell for Poppaea Sabina, the wife of his friend, Marcus Salvius Otho. Poppaea was everything Agrippina was not. Young, beautiful, sensual, and utterly immoral. She whispered to Nero that he wasn't truly emperor, as long as his mother controlled him, claiming he was merely Agrippina's puppet. Sensing the threat, Agrippina fought back with the only tools left to her. She openly supported Britannicus, hinting she might have erred in choosing Nero over Claudius's biological son. This was a fatal miscalculation. The young emperor decided his mother had to die. Yet, killing Agrippina wasn't simple. She was popular with the people, beloved by the army, and protected by loyal guards. Worse, having survived numerous assassination attempts, she was wary of poison. Employing food tasters and antidote experts, Nero needed a method that would seem accidental. His first attempt was a marvel of murderous ingenuity. He commissioned a special boat for his mother, with a collapsible cabin roof designed to crush its occupants, making her death appear to be a tragic sea accident. The plan was to invite Agrippina to a festival at Baiae, load her onto the boat for the return trip, and trigger the mechanism once far from shore. On the night of the festival, March 23rd, 59 AD, Agrippina was in high spirits, believing her son was finally treating her with the respect she deserved as the empress mother. She boarded the boat with her friend, Acerronia, and a few servants, unaware she was entering an elaborate death trap. As the boat moved into deeper water, the mechanism was triggered. The cabin roof, weighted with lead, crashed down with a thunderous crack. But the plan failed. Instead of crushing Agrippina, the debris killed Acerronia. Agrippina, using the survival instincts that had kept her alive through decades of imperial intrigue, threw herself overboard into the dark waters. She was an excellent swimmer, a skill that saved her life. As the crew tried to finish her off with oars and boathooks, she swam toward shore in the darkness, her heavy robes dragging her down, but her will to live keeping her afloat. She heard them shouting behind her, cursing as they searched the dark water for any sign of movement. Somehow, she made it to shore, this woman, who had endured the madness of Caligula, the paranoia of Claudius, and now the murderous intent of her own son, somehow managed to pull herself from the water and stagger to safety. When news reached Nero that his mother had survived, the young emperor panicked. There could be no pretending it was an accident now. Agrippina knew exactly who had attempted to kill her, and she would not stay silent. He likely had only hours before she rallied her supporters and struck back. Nero turned to Anaxatus, admiral of the fleet at Missingham, the architect of the boat trap. "Finish it," he commanded. "Kill her tonight." Anaxatus and a squad of soldiers surrounded Agrippina's villa as she tried to gather her forces. They found her in her bedroom, still wet from the sea, attempting to send messages to her allies. When she saw the armed men burst through her door, she knew her time had come. But Agrippina faced her death with the dignity that had defined her life. She stood tall, looked her killers in the eye, and spoke her final words. "Strike my womb first. Let them drive their swords into the body that bore such a monster." The soldiers hesitated briefly. This was not some helpless victim, but the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of a Caesar, the mother of their emperor. But orders were orders. The blades fell repeatedly, hacking through flesh and bone, until Agrippina the Younger, the most powerful woman in the Roman Empire, lay dead in a pool of her own blood. When Nero received confirmation that his mother was dead, his first emotion was not grief or guilt, but relief. The woman who had made him emperor and then tried to control him was finally gone. He was truly free to rule as he wished, but the matricide would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Roman people might have accepted the murder of a political rival, but killing one's own mother violated the most sacred bonds of family and religion. Rumor spread like wildfire through the city. Nero had not only murdered his mother, but had forced his way into her bedroom afterward to gloat over her naked corpse, examining her body and commenting on which parts were beautiful and which were flawed. Whether or not this ghoulish tale was true, it captured something essential about the monster Nero was becoming. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, committing an act so unnatural it transformed him from a cruel young man into something barely human. And the worst was yet to come. With Agrippina dead and his other advisors losing influence, Nero was free to indulge his every whim. He pursued pleasure with the same intensity he once applied to murder. He raced chariots in private circuits, performed on stage for select audiences, and engaged in sexual escapades that shocked even the jaded aristocrats of Rome. Nero's marriage to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, was always more political than passionate. She was a quiet, virtuous woman who embodied everything Nero found dull about traditional Roman values. Instead, he favored the company of Poppaea Sabina, who eventually persuaded her husband Otho to divorce her so she could openly pursue the emperor. Poppaea was everything Octavia was not: ambitious, manipulative, and entirely without moral constraints. She understood that power was the ultimate aphrodisiac and used her influence over Nero like a weapon. Under her sway, Nero began to view murder not as a necessity, but as entertainment. The first victim was Marcus Junior Silanus, a descendant of Augustus, who was guilty of nothing but possessing imperial blood. Nero had him poisoned simply because his lineage made him a potential rival. Next was Plautus, another imperial family member, executed on the flimsiest of pretexts. Nero's thirst for blood grew, and soon even his inner circle wasn't safe. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect who had guided him in his early years, died suspiciously, officially from throat cancer, though many suspected poison. With Burrus gone, Seneca's position became untenable, forcing the old philosopher into retirement. By 62 AD, 5 years into his reign, Nero had eliminated anyone who might restrain him. He was accountable to no one, feared by all, and intoxicated by the power of life and death over millions. It was then he decided Octavia had to go. She hadn't done anything wrong except fail to provide an heir and stand in the way of Nero's obsession with Poppaea. In Nero's mind, these were crimes worthy of death. The problem was Octavia's popularity with the people, who saw her as a link to the beloved Claudius and a symbol of traditional Roman virtue. Nero first attempted divorce, claiming their marriage was invalid due to their close relation. When that didn't appease public opinion, he accused Octavia of adultery with various men, including slaves. Under torture, her alleged lovers confessed to whatever their interrogators demanded, their screams echoing through the imperial dungeons. Yet, the Roman people wouldn't accept these obvious lies. When Nero announced his intention to marry Poppaea, riots erupted in the streets. Crowds surrounded the palace, demanding Octavia's restoration as empress. Statues of Poppaea were torn down and dragged through the mud, while images of Octavia were adorned with flowers. For a moment, Nero hesitated. The riots reminded him that despite his power, he still depended on the people's support. He briefly took Octavia back, allowing her to return to the palace, while Poppaea was quietly moved to a villa outside the city. But Poppaea was not a woman to accept defeat easily. She knew her future hinged on becoming empress, and she was ready to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. She persuaded Nero that the riots were evidence of a larger conspiracy, that Octavia was secretly plotting against him, and that only her death could ensure his safety. The emperor needed little convincing. He had Octavia arrested on charges of treason and adultery and sent off to the island of Panditaria, the same place where her grandmother Julia had died in exile decades earlier. But exile was insufficient for Nero's paranoid mind. Within days, he ordered her execution. Octavia was only 20 years old when the soldiers came for her. She had been a pawn in political games her entire life, married off as a child to secure alliances, divorced, and remarried at the whims of her stepbrother husband. Now, as she faced her final moments, she showed a dignity absent from her short life. The soldiers bound her hands and opened her veins, allowing her blood to slowly drain into the floor of her prison cell. It was a merciful form of execution, no cross, no beheading, just a gradual slide into unconsciousness as her life ebbed away. She died calling out the names of her father, Claudius, and her murdered stepbrother, Britannicus, her last words a prayer that their spirits would welcome her into whatever lay beyond. Her head was cut off and brought to Rome as proof of her death, presented to Poppaea like a grotesque wedding gift. The woman who had dreamed of being empress gazed upon the severed head of her predecessor and smiled with satisfaction. 12 days later, Nero and Poppaea were married in a lavish ceremony that cost more than most provinces generated in a year. The palace was decorated with gold and precious stones, and the wine flowed like water, with the emperor performing a special song he had composed for the occasion. Rome now had a new empress, one who had climbed to the throne over the corpses of those who stood in her way. But even as Nero celebrated his new marriage, darker forces were at play. The monster he had become was not satisfied with simple murder. He craved spectacle, drama, and destruction that would echo through history. Soon, Rome itself would burn. The Great Fire of Rome began on the night of July 18th, 64 AD, in the shops surrounding the Circus Maximus. It started small, perhaps from an overturned oil lamp or an unattended cooking fire. But the summer had been dry, the wooden buildings were tinder-ready, and the wind was strong. What began as a minor blaze quickly became an inferno, consuming 3/4 of the city. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire raged through Rome's crowded districts. The flames leaped from building to building faster than people could flee, turning the narrow streets into death traps filled with smoke and falling debris. The fortunate ones found refuge in the Campus Martius, or the gardens of the wealthy, huddling together as they watched their city burn. The less fortunate were engulfed by the flames, their cries drowned out by the roaring inferno. Ancient sources disagree on Nero's whereabouts when the fire ignited. Some say he was in Antium, his birthplace, and hurried back to Rome once he heard the news. Others claim he was in the city from the start, organizing relief efforts and opening his palace to refugees. However, the most persistent and damning account comes from Tacitus, suggesting that as Rome burned, Nero saw an opportunity. According to this version, as the flames consumed the city, Nero climbed a high tower and began to sing. He chose the Iliad by Homer, recounting Troy's destruction, performing with all the dramatic passion he brought to the stage, while his subjects fled. Children burned in collapsing buildings, and a millennium of Roman history turned to smoke. Their emperor treated the city's greatest disaster as inspiration for his art. Whether or not this account is literally true, it reflects something essential about Nero's character, a man so detached from human emotion, so intoxicated by his artistic grandeur, he could find beauty in unimaginable suffering. The destruction of Rome wasn't a tragedy to mourn, but a spectacle to savor. When the fire finally died out, the devastation was nearly complete of Rome's 14 districts. Only 4 remained intact. The rest lay in ash and rubble, a moonscape of destruction stretching for miles. Hundreds of thousands were homeless, their possessions destroyed, their livelihoods gone, and thousands lay dead. Many burned beyond recognition, their bodies contributing to the stench that hung over the ruined city like a shroud. But for Nero, the fire was not a disaster. It was an opportunity. Even as the ashes were still warm Nero walked through the ruins with his architects, sketching plans for a new Rome that would surpass anything the ancient world had seen. He called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, intended as his masterpiece, a palace complex so vast and opulent it would cover nearly a third of the city. Imagine the scale of Nero's ambition, a palace stretching from the Palatine Hill to the Esquiline, covering 300 acres of prime Roman land. The main dining hall was circular, rotating constantly to mimic the motion of the heavens. The walls were adorned with gold leaf and precious gems, the ceilings decorated with ivory and mother-of-pearl that captured light like stars. Artificial lakes replaced neighborhoods, and at the center stood a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, 120 feet tall, its face eternally turned toward the sun in glory. The true obscenity wasn't the palace's size or cost, but how quickly construction began. As bodies were still being pulled from the rubble, Nero's workers started demolishing remaining structures to create space for his pleasure dome. Families who had lost everything in the fire watched in horror as their former neighborhoods turned into gardens for the emperor's enjoyment. People began to whisper that the fire was no accident. They recalled how swiftly Nero seized the charred land and how eager he seemed to start his grandiose building project. Rumors spread like wildfire through the refugee camps. Nero had ordered the fire, they said. He watched Rome burn because he wanted to rebuild it in his image. Nero heard these whispers and knew he needed a scapegoat. His solution was as calculated as it was cruel. He blamed the Christians. This strange new cult from the eastern provinces made perfect targets. They were foreign, worshipped a crucified criminal as a god, and often spoke of the world ending in fire. Most Romans found their beliefs bizarre and threatening, making them ideal villains for Nero's purposes. The persecution that followed was a masterpiece of sadistic theater. Nero didn't just execute the Christians, he turned their deaths into entertainment for the masses. In his private gardens, he covered them in pitch and set them ablaze as human torches to light his evening parties. The screams of the burning victims provided a soundtrack for the emperor's poetry recitations, their writhing bodies casting shadows on his dinner guests' faces. Others were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs, torn apart while the crowd cheered. Still others were crucified in elaborate tableaus, sometimes dressed as mythological figures to add an artistic element to their suffering. Nero himself often directed these spectacles, positioning victims for maximum visual impact, adjusting lighting, and critiquing performances like a theater director staging a challenging play. But even as he fed Christians to the flames, Nero's appetite for destruction grew beyond anything Rome had seen. The monster was evolving, transcending mere cruelty and approaching madness. During this period, he committed what many considered his most shocking crime, yet the murder of his pregnant wife, Poppaea. By 65 AD, Poppaea was carrying Nero's child, a daughter they would name Claudia Augusta. For a brief moment, it seemed that becoming a father might humanize the emperor. He doted on Poppaea during her pregnancy, showering her with gifts and attention. When their daughter was born, he declared public holidays and ordered celebrations throughout the empire. Claudia Augusta lived only 4 months before succumbing to illness, and her death sent Nero into a rage that ultimately cost Poppaea her life. While the exact circumstances of Poppaea's death differ depending on the ancient source, they all agree on the essentials. She was pregnant again, and Nero was to blame. Suetonius offers the most damning account, claiming the emperor kicked his wife in the abdomen during a violent argument about his obsession with chariot racing. Imagine the scene. Poppaea, heavily pregnant, confronting her husband about his latest excesses. Perhaps she was tired of playing second fiddle to his horses and gladiators. Perhaps she realized The man she had manipulated into marriage was beyond any woman's control. The argument escalated, voices echoing through the palace corridors, until Nero, who commanded legions and could order a senator's execution with a word, lost his temper entirely and struck the one person bold enough to criticize him. The kick landed squarely on her swollen belly. Poppaea doubled over in agony, clutching her stomach as blood flowed down her legs. She tried to speak, but the pain overwhelmed her, and she collapsed on the marble floor, her unborn child dying inside her. Nero stood over her, watching the life drain from the woman who had helped him murder his way to absolute power. There was no remorse in his eyes, no recognition of his deed, only irritation that she had dared oppose him. He called for slaves to clean up the mess and returned to planning his next chariot race. Losing Poppaea left a void in Nero's life he couldn't fill. She had been more than a wife, his partner in crime, his accomplice in murder, the one who truly understood his capacity for evil. Without her, he felt incomplete, lost, desperate to find someone to replace what he had destroyed. That's when he noticed Sporus. The boy, perhaps 13 or 14, was a slave in the imperial household, bearing a striking resemblance to Poppaea. He had the same delicate features, golden hair, and graceful movements that first attracted Nero to his dead wife. In the emperor's twisted mind, a plan formed. So depraved it shocked even Rome's jaded aristocrats. Nero ordered Sporus brought to him privately. The boy, unaware of what awaited him, likely expected a minor household duty or to be sold to another master. Instead, Nero announced Sporus would be castrated. The operation was performed by imperial physicians, men sworn to heal, but who dared not defy their emperor's commands. They held the struggling boy down as a heated blade removed his manhood, his screams echoing through the palace corridors, while Nero watched with satisfaction. The emperor wanted to ensure Sporus could never become a man, forever trapped in the feminine form that reminded Nero of his murdered wife. But castration was just the start of Sporus's torment. As the boy recovered, Nero dressed him in women's clothing, styled his hair like an empress, and painted his face with cosmetics to enhance his resemblance to Poppaea. Teachers were brought in to instruct him in feminine deportment, teaching him to walk, speak, and gesture like a woman. Once the transformation was complete, Nero announced he would marry Sporus in a formal ceremony. The wedding was a grotesque parody of Roman tradition. Sporus was dressed in a bride's veil and gown, his castrated body perfumed and adorned with jewelry. A dowry was presented, contracts were signed, and traditional rituals were performed, while the assembled nobles watched in horrified silence. No one dared to object or risk the emperor's wrath by pointing out the obscenity of what they were witnessing. After the ceremony, Nero began referring to Sporus as his wife, demanding others in the court address him as empress. He had a special litter made so they could appear together in public, the emperor and his bride touring Rome, while people stared in disbelief at what their ruler had become. But Nero's cruelty toward Sporus went beyond public humiliation. In private, he subjected the boy to sexual abuse that was shocking even by the standards of a society that routinely exploited slaves. Sporus was forced to play the role of Poppaea in Nero's twisted fantasies, enduring whatever perversions the emperor devised. The boy's suffering was worsened by knowing he could never escape. Castrated and feminized, he was neither man nor woman, existing solely for Nero's pleasure. He had no allies, no protectors, no hope of rescue. His only choice was to submit to whatever torments the emperor inflicted, or face an even worse death. Meanwhile, Nero's reign of terror expanded beyond the palace walls. The emperor forced nobles to participate in degrading spectacles, compelling senators and knights to fight as gladiators or perform on stage like common actors. These men, who had spent their lives building careers and reputations, were reduced to entertainment for Nero's amusement. Some tried to resist. Marcus Junius Solinus chose suicide rather than submit to Nero's demands. Lucius Aeneas. Seneca, the emperor's former tutor, also took his own life when ordered to do so, opening his veins in a bathtub while dictating his final thoughts to a scribe. Yet, for every noble who chose death over dishonor, many more submitted to whatever humiliation Nero demanded. The emperor's nocturnal escapades through Rome became infamous for their violence and depravity. Disguised in plain clothes, Nero would wander the streets with a group of fellow aristocrats, attacking random citizens for amusement. They would assault shopkeepers, rape women, rob travelers, and sometimes kill solely for entertainment. When victims tried to defend themselves, they often faced treason charges the next day, their resistance against an unknown attacker retroactively labeled as an assault on the emperor himself. Perhaps Nero's most shocking invention was his dinner parties that lasted from sunset to dawn, where guests were encouraged to indulge every possible vice. These gatherings featured not just excessive food and drink, but also elaborate sexual performances, torture exhibitions, and sometimes live executions for entertainment. Wealthy Romans, eager to stay in the emperor's good graces, felt compelled to attend these orgies, bringing their wives and daughters to partake in whatever degradations Nero devised. The emperor often performed at these gatherings, singing while naked slaves were tortured, or playing his lyre as prisoners were fed to wild animals. He believed that art was enhanced by real suffering, that music sounded sweeter when accompanied by genuine screams of pain. As news of these excesses spread throughout the empire, Nero's support began to wane, even among those who initially welcomed his rule. The armies stationed far from Rome heard alarming reports about their emperor's behavior. Provincial governors, who once sent flattering letters to the capital, started to distance themselves from the regime. Even the Praetorian Guard, supposedly the emperor's most loyal supporters, began to grumble about the man they were sworn to protect. But Nero remained oblivious to the growing discontent. Drunk on power and convinced of his own artistic genius, he believed his subjects adored him as much as he adored himself. When reports of criticism from the provinces reached him, he dismissed them as jealousy from inferior minds unable to appreciate his vision. In this state of delusional confidence, Nero decided to undertake his greatest artistic endeavor, a tour of Greece where he would compete in every major festival to prove he was the greatest performer in history. The trip to Greece in 66-89 AD was a year-long spectacle of ego and corruption. Nero competed in every event, singing, lyre playing, chariot racing, even acting, and won every competition he entered. The fix was blatant and shameless. Judges who had spent their lives evaluating talent suddenly declared a mediocre Roman emperor the greatest artist they had ever seen. At the Olympic Games, Nero famously fell from his chariot and didn't finish the race, yet was still declared the winner. The judges, likely fearing for their lives, decided his noble intentions warranted victory, despite not completing the course. During his tour of Greece, Nero amassed over 100 first-place crowns, more than any performer in history. He returned to Rome triumphantly, parading in the same chariot Augustus had used for military victories. However, instead of celebrating military conquests, Nero celebrated victories over singers and actors, treating artistic competitions like military campaigns. The Roman people watched this spectacle with a mix of embarrassment and anger. Their emperor, instead of governing, had spent a year indulging in foreign theatrics. Worse, he had drained the treasury for his extended escapades, imposing new taxes on an already burdened population. Meanwhile, a real crisis was unfolding in the provinces, where governors and generals began doubting Rome's ability to endure Nero's rule. In Gaul, Gaius the Physindex incited rebellion, declaring the need for a new emperor. In Spain, Galba assembled an army. Even Africa, usually peaceful, showed signs of unrest. News of these rebellions reached Nero while he basked in his artistic triumphs. Rather than concern, he felt excitement at the chance for more drama and spectacle, imagining theatrical executions and poetic justice for the rebels. He commissioned songs about future victories and designed costumes for his triumphant returns. To him, these revolts were not threats, but opportunities to stage the greatest show in history. However, as reports from the provinces increased, Nero began to realize something was seriously wrong. The revolt spread faster than expected, with Galba marching toward Rome with a professional army. For the first time, Nero faced a genuine military threat from a competent general with nothing to lose. Nero's response showed his detachment from reality. Instead of rallying forces or negotiating, he planned a theatrical tour of Egypt, believing his talents would be better appreciated there. He sent messages to provincial governors, explaining he was temporarily unavailable due to artistic commitments, but would address the rebellion when possible. Meanwhile, Rome's situation was rapidly deteriorating. The Praetorian Guard, sensing the shifting power, began secret communications with Galba's representatives. Senators, long silenced by fear, started meeting privately to discuss alternatives to Nero's rule. Even the common people, once entertained by the emperor's spectacles, were growing tired of his antics. The end came swiftly, as it often does for tyrants who see themselves as invincible. On June 8, 68 AD, Nero awoke to find the Praetorian Guard had deserted him overnight. The Senate labeled him a public enemy and sentenced him to a flogging, a punishment usually reserved for the lowest criminals. For the first time, Nero found himself truly alone. His bodyguards were gone, his supporters vanished, and even his slaves began slipping away from the palace under cover of darkness. The man who had commanded loyalty through fear and violence discovered that terror was a weak foundation for power. In his final hours, Nero's true character was revealed not through grand gestures or speeches, but through pitiful displays of cowardice and self-pity. He wandered through his empty palace, alternating between weeping and raging, calling for Sporus to comfort him. The castrated boy, dressed in women's clothing, still played the role of empress to a fallen emperor, and was perhaps the only one in Rome who couldn't abandon him. As news arrived that Galba's forces were approaching, Nero realized his reign was over. Yet he couldn't face reality with dignity. Instead of making a stand or negotiating surrender, he decided to flee Rome and seek mercy from the Parthians, Rome's greatest enemies. The plan was cowardly and unrealistic. Nero would sneak out at night, reach the coast, and sail to the Eastern Empire, imagining the Parthian king would welcome him as a fellow artist. In his delusion, he saw himself living in exotic luxury, performing for foreign audiences while Rome burned. But when Nero tried recruiting accomplices for his escape, he found his reign of terror left him without a single true ally. Former friends refused to see him, loyal servants claimed illness, and even hired musicians declined to join him. The emperor, surrounded by flatterers, discovered that superficial loyalty dissolved when truly needed. With dawn approaching and Galba's army closing in, Nero made a final desperate decision. He would flee to his freedman Phaon's villa, about 4 miles outside the city, and hide there while planning his next move. It was a pitiful end for a man who once commanded legions, sneaking out of his capital like a common criminal, reduced to seeking refuge from a former slave. The journey to Phaon's villa was a humiliating trek through the Roman countryside. Nero, who had spent his life being carried in golden litters and riding in jeweled chariots, now found himself on foot in the pre-dawn darkness, stumbling through fields and olive groves, avoiding roads where his pursuers might spot him. He covered his face with a cloak, accompanied only by 4 loyal companions: Farn the freedman, Epaphroditus his secretary, Neophytus his valet, and Sporus, still dressed as a woman, continuing his role even as the world crumbled around them. This strange procession, a fallen emperor, 3 servants, and a castrated boy in drag, moved through the countryside like a grotesque parody of imperial dignity. When they reached Fawn's villa, Nero's companions dug a tunnel under the foundation because the emperor was too afraid to approach the front door. He crawled through this makeshift tunnel on his hands and knees, emerging into a small basement room where he would spend his final hours cowering like a trapped animal. The villa was modest by imperial standards, with only a few small rooms and simple furnishings, far from the luxury Nero had always known. For a man accustomed to palaces adorned with gold and precious stones, dining off silver plates and drinking from jeweled cups, the stark simplicity of Fawn's home must have seemed like another world. Yet it was here, in this unremarkable building, that the most powerful man on earth would meet his end. In that cramped basement, as the first light of June 9th filtered through the grimy windows, Nero finally faced the reality he had avoided all his life. He was utterly alone. The companions who had followed him into exile huddled in the corners, no longer the sycophantic courtiers who once hung on his every word, but frightened men, wondering if they would survive their connection to a fallen tyrant. Sporus sat silent in women's robes, his makeup streaked with tears, perhaps mourning not for Nero, but for his own uncertain future, in a world that had no place for what the emperor had made him. As the hours passed, messengers brought increasingly dire news. Galba's army was already inside Rome. The Senate had not only confirmed Nero's death sentence, but ordered that he be dragged naked through the streets, flogged until dead, and thrown into the Tiber River like a common criminal. The Praetorian Guard was actively hunting him, eager to deliver his head to the new emperor to prove their loyalty. But perhaps the most devastating blow came when a courier arrived with news from the palace. Nero's servants were raiding his private quarters, seizing golden statues, precious artworks, and even his collection of theatrical costumes. The slaves who once feared him now fought over his possessions, like scavengers picking at a carcass. Upon hearing of this final indignity, something within Nero finally snapped. The man who once commanded the worship of millions, who forced senators to kneel before his golden statue, who saw himself as a god among mortals, collapsed to his knees on the dirt floor of a freedman's basement, weeping like a lost child. "They're stealing my things," he sobbed, his voice cracking with the same weakness he had once mocked in others. "My beautiful things, my costumes, my lyres." The emperor, who had murdered his mother, wives, rivals, and countless innocents, was reduced to tears over material possessions, unable to grasp that his crimes had repercussions beyond losing trinkets. As morning progressed, the sound of horses grew in the distance as search parties combed the countryside, drawing ever closer to the villa. Nero's remaining companions exchanged meaningful glances, weighing whether their chances were better staying with the emperor or abandoning him to save themselves. It was then that Epaphroditus, his secretary, spoke the words that would force Nero to confront his fate. "Caesar, you must act now. They will be here within the hour, and what they do to you will be far worse than anything you've done to others. Remember Marcus Crassus. Remember how the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat. Remember every torture you have ordered, every creative death you devised. They will show you no mercy." This reminder of his own cruelty had the intended effect. Nero's sobs turned to panic as he imagined himself subjected to the same torments he had inflicted on others. He thought of the Christians he had burned alive, their screams echoing through his gardens. He recalled the way Octavia's blood pooled on her prison floor. He pictured Agrippina's expression as the swords pierced her flesh. For the first time, the monster understood what it felt like to be prey. "I cannot die like this," he whispered, barely audible. "Not like a common criminal. Not dragged through the streets for their amusement. I am Caesar. I am descended from the divine Augustus. I am an artist, a poet, a performer who has brought beauty into the world." Even now, in this moment of ultimate defeat, Nero's narcissism remained intact. He couldn't see himself as others did, a murderous tyrant whose death would be celebrated throughout the empire. In his mind, he was a misunderstood genius, a victim of lesser minds who couldn't appreciate his vision. Phaon, who had known Nero for years and understood his psyche better than most, knelt beside his former master and spoke with unexpected gentleness. "Then die as Caesar should die. Choose your own manner of death. Show them you still possess your ancestors' courage." The unspoken suggestion of suicide had lingered since their arrival at the villa, but none had dared to voice it until now. Roman tradition favored a noble, self-inflicted death over execution by enemies, believing that choosing one's moment of departure retained a dignity that couldn't be taken away. However, Nero had never shown physical bravery. Every murder he ordered was executed by others, and every enemy was eliminated through poison, treachery, or hired assassins. The thought of driving a blade into his flesh, feeling the steel pierce his skin and organs, filled him with revulsion. "I cannot," he protested, his voice rising to a whine. "You don't understand. My hands are artists' hands, meant for creating beauty, not violence. I have never harmed anyone personally. I'm not a warrior or a gladiator. I'm a performer, a musician, a poet." The delusion was astonishing. Here was a man responsible for countless deaths, including his own mother's, claiming innocence. His inability to distinguish between ordering killings and carrying them out himself revealed a profound disconnect between Nero's self-image and reality. Neophytus, his valet, tried a different approach. "Caesar, remember your performances on stage. Think of this as your greatest role, the noble Roman choosing death over dishonor. The audience will remember your exit. Make it memorable." For a moment, Nero's eyes lit up with something akin to enthusiasm. The concept of death as performance, a final artistic statement, appealed to his twisted sensibilities. He began pacing the small room, gesturing dramatically as he envisioned his own death staging. "Yes," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Yes, this could be magnificent. A noble suicide performed with dignity and style. They will write songs about it. Poets will celebrate my courage. History will remember how Nero chose death over surrender." But as he continued planning, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. The search parties were closing in, and time was running out. His companions urged him to act quickly, but Nero seemed paralyzed by indecision, unable to bridge the gap between theatrical fantasy and harsh reality. It was then that a messenger burst into the room with terrifying news. The pursuers had found their trail and were mere minutes away. Soldiers could already be seen in the distance, their armor glinting in the morning sun as they rode toward the villa. The moment of decision came, and Nero finally realized that all his preparations, speeches, and artistic visions were meaningless without the courage to act. With trembling hands, he picked up a dagger placed before him by Epaphroditus, holding it as if it might bite him. "I can't do this alone," he whispered. "Someone must help me. Someone must guide the blade." This was the final act of cowardice from a man whose life had been about making others do his dirty work. Even in death, Nero couldn't take responsibility for his actions. Epaphroditus stepped forward, his face grim with the knowledge of what was about to occur. If you are certain, Caesar, I will help you. But you must start it. You must show that you choose this path." Nero nodded, tears streaming down his face as he placed the dagger's point against his throat. His hand shook so violently he could barely keep the blade in contact with his skin. For long seconds, he stood frozen, unable to summon the will to drive the weapon home. Outside, the sound of horses stopped. Voices could be heard, soldiers calling as they surrounded the villa. Heavy footsteps approached, and the scrape of armor echoed from the main room above their hiding place. "Now," Epaphroditus hissed. "It must be now, or they will take you alive." With a convulsive movement, Nero drove the dagger into his throat, but his aim was poor and his strength failed. The blade entered at an angle, missing major blood vessels and lodging in muscle. Blood flowed, but not enough for a quick death, only enough to cause agonizing pain. Nero collapsed, the dagger still protruding from his neck, making horrible gurgling sounds as blood filled his throat. He tried to speak, but it came out as incomprehensible babble mixed with blood and saliva. Seeing his master's failed suicide attempt would only prolong suffering, Epaphroditus pushed the blade deeper, angling it toward vital arteries. This second thrust hit the mark, and Nero's blood flowed in earnest, pooling beneath his head as his life ebbed away. Even as he died, Nero's narcissism remained. With his last breath, he gasped, "Qualis artifex perio," meaning, "What an artist dies in me." These final words perfectly captured the emperor's delusional self-image. Even as he lay dying in a squalid basement, a victim of his own cruelty, Nero saw himself not as a tyrant getting his just deserts, but as a misunderstood genius whose death was a loss to humanity. The irony was devastating. Here was a man who had never created anything beautiful, whose only art was elaborate tortures and theatrical murders. With his dying breath, Nero claimed the world was losing a great artist, blind to what everyone else saw clearly. His death was not a tragedy, but a liberation. As Nero's eyes glazed over and his breathing ceased, the sound of splintering wood echoed from above. Soldiers had broken down the door and were searching the villa room by room. In minutes, they would find the tunnel and discover the emperor's body. Sporus, still in his feminine attire, knelt beside the man who had ruined his life and made him a living symbol of imperial depravity. What thoughts crossed the boy's mind as he gazed at his tormentor's remains? Relief? Terror? Perhaps just numbness after years of unimaginable abuse. The soldiers discovered them moments later, their torches casting light on the grotesque scene in the basement. A dead emperor lay in his own blood, surrounded by frightened accomplices and the castrated boy he had forced to become his wife. The contrast between imperial pretensions and squalid reality could not have been more stark. When news of Nero's death reached Rome, the reaction was not grief for a fallen Caesar, but explosive celebration. Citizens flooded the streets, dancing and singing, placing flowers on statues of his victims, and defacing every image of the dead emperor they could find. The nightmare was over, and the Roman people could finally express the hatred they had hidden for 14 years. The most telling reaction came from the empire's provinces, where Nero's death sparked such joy that spontaneous festivals erupted across the Mediterranean. From Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, the news of the monster's death prompted celebrations lasting for days. Never had a Roman emperor's death been so universally welcomed. The Senate acted swiftly to damn Nero's memory, ordering his name chiseled from monuments, his statues melted down, and his image removed from coins. They aimed to erase every trace of his existence, to pretend the Roman Empire had never been ruled by such a creature. Yet their historical censorship could not erase the memory of Nero's deeds, or the lessons his reign taught about the corruption of absolute power. His crimes were too numerous, too shocking, too well documented to simply vanish from history. The Domus Aurea, his golden palace built on Rome's ashes, was systematically destroyed by subsequent emperors who filled its rooms with concrete and built public baths and amphitheaters on its ruins. Where Nero once planned to house his artistic genius, the Colosseum would rise, a monument to public entertainment rather than imperial ego. Sporus, the castrated boy forced to play the role of empress, faced an uncertain future in the new regime. Some sources suggest he was initially protected by Otho, who briefly succeeded Galba as emperor, though his ultimate fate is unknown. Perhaps he simply vanished into the anonymity of Rome's underworld, finally free from the role forced upon him. Historical sources that chronicled Nero's life and death, like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, expressed thinly veiled disgust at his crimes, struggling with the extent of his depravity as if language itself fell short. Tacitus claimed Nero left no abomination uncommitted, while Suetonius detailed his crimes with a prosecutor's precision. These historians knew they were documenting not just an emperor's fall, but how unchecked power could corrupt civilization itself. Nero's legacy extended beyond personal crimes. His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, ruling since Augustus. The subsequent year of the four emperors Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian showed the chaos from a collapsed imperial authority. Fundamentally, Nero's example warned of absolute power's dangers. Rome's government, initially designed to prevent excessive individual power, evolved into an empire where one man's whims dictated millions' fates. Nero's reign showed the logical end of such a system, where the most powerful was also the most corrupt. The parallels to modern tyrannies are unavoidable. Like Nero, many dictators have combined grandiosity with cruelty, convinced their crimes were justified by supposed genius, surrounded by sycophants enabling their worst impulses. The emperor who demanded divine worship died alone in a basement, abandoned except by his victims. The man who commanded legions through terror found fear wasn't a substitute for respect. The artist claiming eternal beauty left a legacy of pain and destruction. Most damning, Nero's final words showed he learned nothing. Even in death, he saw himself as a misunderstood genius, not a monster who got what he deserved. His failure to see himself clearly or grasp the true nature of his crimes made his downfall complete. Nero's death stands as history's example of poetic justice. The man who lived by violence and cruelty died in terror and pain. The emperor who had compelled others to perform for his entertainment ended his life with a theatrical suicide that deceived no one. The tyrant who demanded worship from his subjects was left to die like a common criminal. Ultimately, Nero's reign is a reminder that even the most absolute power is temporary, that cruelty and oppression carry the seeds of their own downfall, and that history has a way of delivering justice to those who consider themselves beyond its reach. The last Julio-Claudian emperor promised the Roman people he would rule with mercy and wisdom. Instead, he gave them 14 years of murder, depravity, and madness. His death in that squalid basement, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, was not a tragedy, but a liberation, the end of a nightmare that had lasted far too long. The monster was finally dead, and the world could begin to heal from the wounds he inflicted. But the memory of what he did and became would echo through history as a warning about the darkness within unchecked power and the terrible price civilization pays when that darkness is allowed to flourish. As his blood soaked into the dirt floor of Faun's villa, Nero's reign of terror reached its inevitable end, not with the grand artistic gesture he had envisioned, but with the pathetic whimper of a coward who had finally run out of victims to blame for his monstrous choices.